And please, can I welcome back onto the stage Marshal Chipman and the Chief of the Air Staff as well. We can continue the discussions. We'd like to open up to the floor for questions now. We do have some roving microphones. But first of all, Air Chief Marshal, could I get your reflections on the Minister's thoughts a little earlier today?
So I had a pretty good idea what he was going to say, because I spent an hour and a half with him earlier in the week. And I think we spoke yesterday about the depth of understanding in the wider community about air power, and it was wonderful to hear the Minister to really set out his understanding of the value and importance of air power in future operations. And I think the challenges that he's set us in terms of how do we maintain that operational advantage, and how do we think and exploit and use this expertise and skills that we've got, is exactly right. And I think what you heard from the three of us is theories of winning and approaches to maintaining security is exactly what he had in mind. So I was really, really excited by it.
And you both had the same ninja thoughts I saw coming through. And clearly, agility is absolutely central to all of this. Do you think you're on the same page in terms of how to achieve that agility?
I'd have to talk to him about that. I don't know. I suspect so, actually. And one of the things that impresses people who don't understand air power is the inherent flexibility and the speed of response. And I think you'll know that the Minister is an ex-soldier, former soldier, and he has definitely talked to me about how much he has learned in his new role compared to what he understood as a young captain and major in the Army. So I suspect, actually, we are very much on the same page, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions that I can put to the chiefs on stage with me right now? If not, I shall just plough on. And it'd be really interesting to get your reflections, General Saltzman, about just how crucial space has been in the conflict in Ukraine. Obviously, right at the beginning, there was a lot of talk about Elon Musk's involvement in Starlink and that kind of that line really hit the headlines, certainly in the early days. But, unpicking it, how would you say space has played a part?
I think it's pretty obvious it's played a central part, maybe more so than we've seen in some other conflicts. I'll tell you that I learned early on that I have to pay attention to securing the networks that enable on-orbit capabilities. Cyber attacks are just as crippling to space capabilities as kinetic attacks on orbit. And so thinking about networks, thinking about cyber vulnerabilities is part and parcel with my business, just like on-orbit operations are. But I think the Minister kind of made this point better than I will be able to, but it was clear to me that if you think you can just buy the most exquisite equipment and be successful on the battlefield, you got another thing coming. It's the operational concepts, it's combined arms, it's exquisite command and control, it's logistics and sustainability. And if you can't put all that together, the credibility of your force goes down rapidly. And so we're thinking about that in terms of space being available to support all of the operations continuously as being a key component of that credibility.
Yes.
Can I just make one additional point? Salty and I chatted about this yesterday. One of the fascinating things about that early part of the war in Ukraine was the role of commercial space in providing really high-quality intelligence that enabled really important insights to what was going on and what Russia's actions were. And I think there's a really interesting challenge for us to understand quite the right balance between commercially provided satellite intelligence and surveillance reconnaissance and that which we need to own either sovereignly or as a military capability.
And the commercial augmentation that's been provided. We saw the Starlink contributions, which you can learn about how rapidly commercial services can provide some military utility. And at the same time, having a proliferated constellation proves to be far more resilient than singular satellite communication satellites. So we're learning a lot there as well.
Marshal Chip, what's your take on this?
I no longer speak with authority on space, but no, I completely agree. And that idea, firstly, I love the way in which we put people first, and the way the Minister did that was quite brilliant, actually. And I think all of us would agree, as Air Chiefs and Space Chiefs in the audience, it's the thing that gives you the most pride day to day is watching the achievements and the efforts of your workforce. And I'm sure we would all share stories like those. And I absolutely agree that if you're able to to harness that capability, in some ways just give them the direction and the vector and then get out of their way, then that is a strategic effect. In terms of space, I mentioned before that we have had a change of responsibilities in Australia, but I'm no less passionate about the need for space and the need to be able to work effectively across all warfighting domains simultaneously. And so I look forward to seeing our space capability grow under General FREng.
Thank you. If any of the media would like to ask any questions, do you want to open the floor to make sure that everybody is represented? Yes, go ahead.
Hi, how are you? Vaga Muradian from Defense and Aerospace Report. Maybe this question is better suited for General Saltzman. Yesterday, you talked about grappling, kinetic effects. There's jamming, but there's concern that there are mine satellites that are also on intersecting orbits. The Chinese, from the ASAT test they conducted, there's still a vast debris field that's expanding further. There are some who've posited that China's balloon flights are actually an effort to find alternate means of being able to do strategic reconnaissance. For example, if your adversary wants to take all of space out because they might see as an advantage. This is a great power that doesn't seem to be inclined to being embarrassed or anything else. What's the strategic approach to shape, to dissuade? Because as the Russians did with the dam in Ukraine, if they see advantage to blowing it, they'll blow it, even if it hurts their own forces to do it, because they're more concerned about the tactical element of it. What's the strategic approach to dissuading people from doing stuff in space that they shouldn't be doing because it's going to be as bad for them as anybody else?
I think at the strategic level, the thought is that if we can maintain a degree of competition, as I mentioned, being a better preferable condition to crisis or conflict, then we're on a safer ground. But competition has ebbs and flows, and there's ebbing and flowing of strategic advantage when you're in a state of competition. Not escalating, not taking too much advantage, but managing a level of stability. And what we've always called deterrence has almost, because of our forces that have been made available, start to almost be compellents, especially when you talk about it in the conventional sense. We will deter you to the point where you change your behavior. That's a bit of strategic overreach, I think. I think the better way to think about it from a strategic standpoint is we have to manage stability of the relationship. And you can do that through military forces. You must do that through a whole-of-government approach, with the military instrument being well integrated into that whole-of-government approach.
You mentioned, obviously, this kind of sustained competition, but you also talked about the fact that there's 44,800 objects currently in space right now. How does this meet with our sustainability goals?
Yeah, there's 44,800 objects, but space turns out it's pretty big. I think there's at least that many cars on the streets here in London. At least on the one road I was on here coming in. So, I'm not making too much light of it. We have to manage this, and that's why I'm so intent on really improving our space domain awareness capabilities. We don't, as people, with the exception of a few astronauts, literally experience and visualize the domain. We rely on sensors to tell us what's going on, and that can be a little unnerving for other domains that are used to experiencing a little more firsthand. And so we have to have exquisite capabilities to know what's going on. But I point out all the time that at any given day, there are 42,000 flights in the air over the continental United States. And we manage it without too much safety of flight issues. And so it's just something that has to be managed, and now we have to up our capabilities to be able to do that.
Brendan Mulvaney yesterday on one of the panels was just highlighting the difference in the way that, the policy in China in terms of kind of academia and industrial exploitation compared to Western nations. And the same goes for space as well, doesn't it? We talk about all the commercial entities that are launching satellites into space. That could be irksome going forward for the Chinese, and the fact that there is this more independence of activity that isn't controlled by a state. How do you see that playing out going forward?
I've said many times to U.S. audiences, one of the great asymmetric advantages we have is the innovation engine that is the U.S. industry, particularly in space. And so we leverage it as best we can. One of the questions that I've had to come to terms with as we establish a new service for space is what are the inherently military functions that should or must be performed by space operators in the service, and what are those things that we can contract out or get as a commercial service. And getting that balance right early on will be important so that we can continue to fuel that innovation engine.
Okay, thank you. And Marshal Chipman, I wanted to pick up on an element that you talked about in your speech, this kind of mesh of partnerships which is being built up. Is that, would you say, an advantage in a way to kind of the NATO-led approach, given some of the conflict that we've seen, even in certain days, between, a bit of a war of words between Jens Stoltenberg and Chinese counterparts about NATO's involvement and standpoint towards the Indo-Pacific? Do you think having a mesh of partnerships might be better diplomatically?
Well, I think it's incredibly useful to have different ways of solving problems. Some might be done bilaterally, some might be done unilaterally, and some might be done through the United Nations. You need to find the right horse for the course to deal with challenges in our environment. So, but yes, in the Indo-Pacific, in the absence of the sorts of structures that exist here in Europe, that network of alliances is really important. And it's really important for all nations in the Indo-Pacific. It creates the space that they need. It creates the opportunities that they need to exercise their own sovereignty. I think Cruiser said it yesterday, and I absolutely agree that what China would like is to deal one-on-one with the US. What we're hoping is that nations banding together will just create stability, a balance of power, and that will mean that all of us can live peacefully.
I can see you nodding vigorously.
Yeah, one of the great advantages that we have in the West is that network of alliances. And you can see with China trying to build it through its Belt and Road Initiative, but we have that network of alliances that goes back many years. And that is a fundamental part of our strength in the West. And as I said, also, we know as nations, we are able to challenge and work together to solve some of these problems in ways that autocratic regimes aren't. And I think that is a particular strength for Western nations that we should draw on. And that's how you drive that innovation engine that Salty talked about.
Mm-hmm. And you intimated, General, about the challenges that you've had, not least starting your career in Qatar, which was quite an unusual beginning. What would you say to any force out there potentially thinking about setting up space operations? What should they consider first?
Well,
Obviously the uniform.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, flags, songs, uniforms. These are important icons. There are tremendous advantages to elevating a domain to a service level. You are suddenly in discussions where you're focused on space, you're focused on the resources associated with space, you're focused on doctrine exclusive to space. It gives what I've just over and over repeated as a focusing effort based on a domain that requires a lot of attention. There are some negatives. I'll speak mostly to the US. We have to plug into the very large bureaucracy that is the Department of Defense. And you have to have a certain amount of capacity to be able to do that effectively. And so the caution is maybe make sure you're willing to submit the right kinds of resources, because at some point, a service can be so small it can't really behave like a service. And so as long as you can put the appropriate amount of resources based on your government's Defense Department, then I think it does give you that service level focus. But it needs to be a deliberate decision.
And Chief Marshal, how do you see it going forward from the UK perspective? We will be hearing a little bit later from Air Vice Marshal Paul Godfrey, UK Space Command. But how does it dovetail into kind of the traditional aspect of the Air Force?
So, I mean, a couple of things I'd bring out. The first is, and Salty and I talked about this yesterday, is it's been remarkable to me to watch how the creation of Space Command, albeit sat within Air Command, has raised the level of understanding and knowledge about space in defence. And Paul Godfrey and his team deserve a huge amount of credit for that work. And they're still a relatively small team, a couple of hundred people, something like that, got us. And that is not big enough to survive on its own as a separate service. But the arguments that Salty lays out in terms of the benefits of that, and when you start thinking about how you're going to compete and adapt in that domain, then that may be where we end up in the future. But right now, it's about consolidating on the capability we've got, developing the space command that we have today, and then let's see where it takes us.
And how do you believe satellite technology will develop, and on which regions? Are we still, do you think, focusing on the main regions that we have headlining here at this conference, so the Indo-Pacific, the High North, the Eastern Flank? Do you think there will be kind of more activity and monitoring over the High North, for example, in years to come?
Yeah, I mean, you saw Harv Smith's chart yesterday, which talked about that Northwest Passage and the potential for that to become more militarised, and certainly to provide access in a way that it can't at the moment. So I think inevitably we were going to want to have better understanding and awareness. And for me, I think the big change in satellite technology over the last decade has been the emergence of low Earth orbit constellations and the impact that can have, and the massive reduction in cost associated with it. And that is transformational. And you overlay on top of that the commercial elements in that domain, and I think that offers military planners and capability planners the opportunity to think about those things differently, and provide you with that kind of awareness all over the planet, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Thank you. And General, you talked about motherships that effectively deploying missiles. How do you see that and the technology of that developing over coming years? And what's needed to counter that? I mean, obviously you've laid out the plan, but do you just see this as an ever-growing threat?
I think our competitors recognize the advantages that we as a coalition gain using space capabilities. And if they can, for relatively low cost and a few missiles, jeopardize the accomplishment of those missions, then they gain the advantage. It's incumbent upon us now to flip that script and mean that a few shots is not going to degrade our missions substantially. So why take the first shot? And so this is about just competing and understanding the calculations associated with deterrence value, and then investing in the constellations and in the disaggregated architectures that we need to deny them that first mover advantage.
And how do you do that, set up those partnerships now? I mean, what kind of long-term contracts are you currently drawing up?
Well, there's many in works with these partners, amongst them. And the idea is, if we can share the cost, interoperable with the missions, so that when we're collecting information on space domain awareness, there's multiple people paying for the capabilities and multiple people sharing in the data, that has value. And that connects us to the mission, which provides a deterrent value.
Okay, well, many thanks. And it's really fascinating to get your thoughts on the next frontier. So I really appreciate your time. I think everybody is in need of a coffee. So if you can make it relatively swift, because we've still got a lot to talk about in the next session before lunch and the coaches arrive. So take a quick coffee and I'll see you back reasonably shortly. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks.